The priest's words were still hanging in the air when she stood up. The room froze. Richard turned, and for the first time in 18 months, he looked afraid. She wasn't there to stop the wedding. She was there to end something else entirely. Before we get to what was inside that envelope, I want to ask you something. If someone took everything from you, your home, your work, 12 years of your loyalty, would you walk away or would you wait? Think about that for a second. And tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe that patience is the most dangerous kind of power, stay with this. The envelope was not thick. That was the first thing people noticed who were close enough to see it. It was slim, almost understated. The kind of thing you could mistake for a wedding card if you weren't paying attention. But Elena had never been careless with details. Inside were 4 documents, printed cleanly, organized and precise, unhurried way of someone who had been preparing this moment for a long time. The first was financial audit, independent, third party, covering a 2-year window that began 8 months before Richard had ever mentioned the word divorce. The second was a record of 3 offshore accounts that had never appeared in any disclosure during their settlement proceedings. Accounts that had received significant transfers during that same window. Transfers that moved quietly, methodically, out of reach before any attorney could flag them. The third document outlined a series of corporate restructuring decisions made inside Richard's company during the marriage. Decisions that Elena had unknowingly signed paperwork adjacent to. Paperwork that, under a closer legal reading, implied a contribution to the company's foundation that had never been acknowledged or compensated. The fourth document was a clause. A single clause buried inside their original divorce agreement that Richard's attorneys had drafted and her attorneys, underfunded, underprepared, and outmaneuvered, had missed entirely. A clause that Elena's new attorney had not missed. Richard's smile faded first, then his posture, then the color in his face. He stood at that altar looking at a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had spent 18 months believing. People assumed Elena had disappeared after divorce, that she had retreated, grieved quietly, rebuilt slowly in the background the way people do when they have lost and they know it. She had done none of those things. Or rather, she had done all of them, but not in the way anyone imagined. She had grieved, yes, but grief for Elena had not been an ending. It had been a starting point, a moment of absolute clarity about what had been done to her and what she intended to do about it. Within 3 months of the settlement, she had hired a forensic accountant, not through a referral, not through anyone connected to Richard's world. She had found him through a colleague of a former colleague, someone entirely outside the circles Richard moved in, someone who had no reason to be loyal to anyone but her. She gave him everything she had, every document, every statement, every scrap of financial paperwork from 12 years of marriage that she had quietly kept copies of, not because she had anticipated betrayal, but because she had always been the organized one, the careful one, the one who filed things properly while Richard moved too fast to look back. What the accountant found took 4 months to piece together fully. What he presented to her attorney took another 2 months to translate into legal language precise enough to hold up under scrutiny. And what her attorney told her on a Tuesday afternoon in a small office on the 14th floor of a building Richard had never set foot in was this. He had hidden assets, deliberately, systematically, beginning long before the divorce was ever discussed out loud. The question was not whether Elena had a case. The question was when she wanted to use it. She had looked out the window for a long moment. Then she had asked one question. When is his next wedding? But the documents were only part of what she had built. While the legal work was moving quietly through its process, Elena had been doing something else. Something Richard would not have anticipated even if someone had told him directly, because it required a version of Elena he had never believed existed. She had been investing, not recklessly, not emotionally, with the same quiet patience she had brought to everything else. During the marriage, she had paid close attention to Richard's business dealings. She had sat in on enough conversations, been present for enough strategy sessions disguised as dinner parties, to understand which of his peripheral companies had real potential and which were vanity projects. She had watched him dismiss certain opportunities because they were too slow, too unglamorous, too long-term for his appetite. She had written them down. After the divorce, using the modest settlement she had received, money Richard assumed would be consumed by rent and survival, she had instead made 3 quiet investments, small stakes, minority positions, the kind of thing that draws no attention and requires no announcement. One of those companies was a logistics software firm that Richard's own company had a significant partnership with, a company that, in the 18 months since the divorce, had grown faster than almost anyone in that space had predicted. Elena now held a blocking stake in it, not enough to control it, but enough that any major transaction Richard needed to run through that company. And he needed to run several, the largest of which was scheduled for the quarter following his wedding, would require her approval. And the board of that company had received a copy of the financial audit the same morning Elena's attorney filed a legal challenge with the court. By the time Richard was standing at that altar, 3 of the 5 board members had already exchanged messages with each other. The wedding guests had no idea. But somewhere in the room, 2 people who had come on behalf of corporate interests were quietly checking their phones. The bride noticed them first. She did not know what they were reading, but she could see from their faces that it was not good news. She turned slightly toward Richard. He was not looking at her. He was looking across the room at his ex-wife, who was seated calmly in the 3rd row from the back, hands folded, expression unreadable. Something shifted in the bride's chest, a feeling she could not name yet, but would spend a long time thinking about afterward. He found her during the cocktail hour. The ceremony had continued. What else could it do? And the guests had moved into an adjoining hall filled with champagne and nervous conversation. Elena had stayed. She had accepted a glass of water from a passing server and positioned herself near a window that looked out over the city. She was not hiding. She was not performing. She was simply present. Richard appeared at her side without announcement. He had excused himself from his new wife with a smile and a whispered word, and crossed the room in the deliberate way of someone who has decided that confrontation is preferable to uncertainty. He stopped beside her, close enough to speak quietly. He did not look at her directly at first. He looked out the window. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was controlled, almost casual. But Elena had spent 12 years learning the difference between Richard's real calm and his performed calm. This was performed. She let a moment pass before she answered. "Nothing," she said. He turned then. He looked at her directly for the first time since she had stood up in that ceremony. "I already have it," she said. He studied her face for something, anger, satisfaction, the pleasure of watching him uncomfortable. He found none of those things. What he found was harder to process. She looked the way someone looks when they have finished a very long and difficult piece of work and can finally set it down. She looked rested. "The audit," he said quietly, "has been filed," she said. "The board has been informed. The settlement challenge is legitimate. My attorney is confident. Yours will tell you the same thing when you call him in the morning." Richard was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved below them, indifferent. "So what is this?" he asked. "What was today?" Elena considered the question genuinely, as if she had not already answered it for herself 100 times. "It was a notification," she said, "that the accounting of our marriage is not finished, that the contributions I made to your business, to your stability, to the years that built what you have, were real, and that I will not allow them to be erased because your paperwork was more sophisticated than mine." She paused. "I don't want to destroy you, Richard. That was never the point." He waited. "I want what was mine recognized. I want the record corrected. And I want to walk away from this completely, finally, without the feeling that I accepted something that was deliberately designed to leave me with nothing." Richard looked at her for a long time. He had prepared for this conversation to be emotional. He had prepared for accusations, for trembling, for the kind of confrontation that he could manage and redirect and eventually control. He had not prepared for this. For her to be this clear, this still, this finished. "And if I don't cooperate," he said, "then the full legal process continues," she said simply. "The board situation develops on its own timeline. The press, And there will be press. These things have a way of finding error. Will cover it the way they cover these things. And your expansion deal, the one you have spent 18 months building toward, will stall indefinitely while everything is examined. She picked up her glass of water. Or we reach a resolution that is fair. That corrects what was hidden. And everyone moves forward. She looked at him one final time. The choice, as it turns out, is yours. And she walked back toward the window and looked out at the city lights below. By 10 o'clock, that evening the whispers had taken on a different quality. Guests who had stayed through dinner were speaking in smaller clusters now. Phones were being checked with more frequency. Someone had seen something online, a legal filing, publicly accessible, that contained language about a prominent businessman and a contested divorce settlement. The details were dry and procedural, but the implication was unmistakable to anyone who read carefully. 2 people left early, without saying goodbye to the groom. The bride sat at the head table and watched her husband work the room, smiling, shaking hands, performing the role of a man who had everything under control. She was good at reading rooms. She had always been good at reading rooms. And what she was reading tonight was a room that had tilted slightly off its axis without anyone acknowledging out loud. She thought about the woman who had stood up during the ceremony. She thought about how calm she had been. She thought about what that kind of calm costs a person, what you have to go through to arrive at it. She did not share these thoughts with anyone. Just before midnight, Elena sat at the desk in her apartment. The city outside her window was quieter now. The light on her desk was the only one on in the room. She opened a folder, not the legal one, a different one, older. Inside were notes she had made during the first weeks after the divorce, fragmented, sometimes barely coherent, written at 3 a.m. when the grief was loudest and the future felt like a wall with no door in it. She read a few lines. Then she closed the folder. She did not need it anymore. She pulled a single document toward her, a new one, a partnership agreement for a project she had been quietly developing for 4 months. Something entirely her own, built from nothing, connected to nothing Richard had ever touched. She signed it, not with relief, not with triumph, with the simple, grounded feeling of a person who has completed one chapter and is ready, genuinely ready, to begin another. Richard was not destroyed. She had not wanted that. He would negotiate. He would adjust. He would find a way to reframe the story for himself the way he always had. But the adjustment would cost him. The record would be corrected. And the version of events in which Elena had simply accepted what she was given and disappeared quietly would no longer be the only version that existed. That mattered. She turned off the desk light. She walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the city. The same city that had watched her lose everything 14 months ago, that had assumed she was done. She breathed. They thought she was broken. She had been building. And what she was building next, the thing she had just signed her name to, the thing Richard had no visibility into and no leverage over, would make everything that happened today look like the opening paragraph of a much longer story. So let me ask you something before we close tonight. Was she justified or did she go too far? I want your honest answer. Not the easy one, the real one, because this story is not as simple as revenge. And Elena is not as simple as a villain or a hero. She is something harder to categorize. A person who was wronged, who refused to perform powerlessness, and who built something real in the silence while everyone assumed she was falling apart. Drop your thoughts below. I read everything. And if you think today was the end of this story, it wasn't, because what she built next made the wedding look small.